They called her a desk soldier the moment she stepped inside, laughing about how she probably fought more keyboards than real enemies. But when the tape on her wrist slipped, and the captain saw the 9 burn marks on her skin, the entire room went quiet. She wasn't trying to show off. Those marks weren't just stories. They were real, and she wasn't just another name on a list. She was the reason their unit even existed. Want to know what those marks really meant? And why 3 cocky reservists got the hardest lesson of their careers? Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Let's dive in. The sun had barely risen when Sergeant Emily Walker walked into the gym at Camp Liberty. The place smelled of disinfectant and the sweat of 100 workouts, a familiar scent shared by every military gym from Fort Bragg to Camp Pendleton. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile light that made everyone look either younger or older than they actually were. At 42, Walker moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from 2 decades of experience. Her hair was pulled back tight under an old army cap, and she wore a faded military t-shirt, its logo almost completely gone from countless washes. The fabric was soft but well-worn, holding the faint lines of military discipline. Her boots weren't perfectly polished like most soldiers, but they were broken and just right, molded by years of walking over terrain that never made it into any manual. She carried herself differently than the weekend warriors who came through the gym. No cocky swagger, no need to make a scene, just quiet purpose. She knew that the loudest person in the room was often the one who hadn't earned the right to speak. At the front desk, Specialist Tom Rivers barely looked up from his tablet, swiping through a digital roster with the practiced efficiency of someone stuck on weekend duty. The sunlight streamed through high windows, casting rays across the gym that made the dust particles hang in the air. Somewhere in the background, a radio crackled with the morning's orders. Sign-ins digital, Rivers muttered, nodding toward the fingerprint scanner that looked like it had survived too many budget cuts. Put your thumb here and wait for the green light. Walker stepped forward and placed her thumb on the scanner. The light flickered, then turned green. Rivers did a double take at the name that popped up on his screen, squinting as if he knew it, but couldn't quite place it. "You're on the sparring list," he asked, his voice carrying a hint of doubt. "I'm cleared for it," she replied flatly, not defensive or aggressive, just stating the facts. Rivers scrolled through his tablet, shrugged when he found nothing wrong, and waved her through. "Main floor's open. Equipment's to the left if you need anything." She nodded, her duffel bag swaying slightly with each step. The sound of her boots clicking against the polished concrete briefly echoed before being swallowed by the noise of the base coming to life. Inside the gym, beams of sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long, golden rectangles across the sparring mats. The air was cooler here, circulating from industrial fans that had been running since before dawn. Weights clanked steadily as the early risers went through their routines, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies lingered from the night before. At the weight bench, 3 reservists stood together, clearly comfortable in their own little world, not bothering to hide their disdain for anything resembling real work. Ben, Jake, and Tyler, all in their mid-20s, had the kind of confidence that comes from being the biggest fish in a very small pond. They were the type of guys who looked good in photos, with their lean builds and well-toned muscles, but had never been put to the test outside the comfort of a training schedule. Fitness that looked good on Instagram, but had never faced the real challenges of combat. Ben noticed her first, his eyes lazily following her across the gym floor. Well, look at this," he muttered to the others. "New recruit or someone's mom got lost looking for the commissary." Jake grinned, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Definitely logistics. Look at those sleeves. Bet she files reports on push-ups, Chris snorted, lifting a weight with more show than purpose. "Total desk soldier vibes. Probably has a certificate for typing speed hanging in her cubicle." They laughed, the kind of easy, casual laughter that men use when they think they're being clever and no one important is around to hear. The sound carried across the gym, mixing with the clank of equipment and the steady hum of the air circulation system. Sergeant Emily Walker set her duffel bag down near the corner wall, unzipping it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She pulled out hand wraps, plain black cloth, Nothing fancy or regulation issued, just functional gear that had been used enough to be soft and pliable. She began wrapping her wrists with practiced efficiency, each loop placed exactly where it needed to be, building layers of protection with movements so automatic they could have been done in complete darkness. As she worked, the compression sleeves on her forearms shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. Her skin was marked, not with tattoos or decorative ink, but with something far more significant: thin vertical lines, precise and uniform, burned into her flesh with a permanence that spoke of ritual and significance. Mark noticed the motion, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of fake friendliness that masked contempt. "This isn't exactly a senior fitness class." Walker continued rapping, not bothering to look up. "Good thing," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with surprising clarity. "Those are usually too easy." Chris laughed, but the sound had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Okay. That's cute. But seriously, this is combat training. A little more intense than chair yoga." She finished with her left wrist and started on her right, the movement still automatic, still precise. "I wasn't planning on sitting down," she replied, the words hanging in the air for a moment. It created a small pocket of tension, and the three men weren't sure how to navigate it. They exchanged glances, each waiting for the others to take the lead in what was beginning to feel less like entertainment and more like something that might require real thought. Chris tried to regain the initiative, stepping forward with exaggerated swagger, the kind men use when they start to feel uncertain. "Look, lady, no disrespect, but you might be in over your head. This isn't exactly beginner's night." Walker looked up for the first time since entering the gym, her eyes meeting his with the kind of steady, unblinking gaze that made him suddenly aware of how young and out of place he sounded. "Then it should be interesting," she said, adjusting the wrap on her right wrist. The compression sleeve shifted again, revealing more of those vertical marks. They weren't random. Each line was exactly the same width, the same spacing, burned into her skin with surgical precision. Chris caught a glimpse of them and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What's with the wrist art?" he asked, trying to inject sarcasm into his voice, but hearing it come out smaller than intended. Jake leaned in for a closer look, his expression shifting from amusement to something approaching unease. "Kill count," he said, but the joke fell flat as soon as the words left his mouth. "What? You binge-watch too much Netflix and decide to give yourself some street cred." Walker finished adjusting her wrap and stood. Her movements were fluid and controlled. She looked at the three of them for a moment, her expression not one of anger or annoyance, but a kind of patient assessment that made them all suddenly aware they were in the middle of something they didn't understand. "Let me know when you want to find out what they really mean," she said, turning toward the sparring mats with a calm confidence that left no room for misinterpretation. They were still laughing, but the sound had changed. It was smaller now, less certain, like men who had just realized they were in over their heads. Whistling past a graveyard, they suddenly realized they might have to walk through it. The sparring area occupied the center of the gym, marked off by regulation mats that had been taped down with military precision. The surface was clean and level, surrounded by enough space for spectators and the inevitable crowd that gathered whenever someone thought they had something to prove. Morning light streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows that would shift and change as the day went on. But for now, everything was illuminated with the clear, honest light of dawn. Sergeant Emily Walker stepped onto the mat and began her warm-up routine. Nothing flashy, nothing designed for show, just the basic movements that kept a body functional. Jump rope at a steady, hypnotic rhythm that spoke of muscle memory carved over years. Shoulder rolls, neck rotations, deep squats that revealed a flexibility most people half her age couldn't match. Every motion was economical, purposeful, the kind of preparation that suggested she'd done this before, in places where being ready wasn't optional. At the weight bench, Ben elbowed Jake in the ribs. "Look at this. She's doing middle school PE warm-ups." "This is going to be embarrassing," Tyler snorted, lifting a weight with more show than purpose. Total desk soldier vibes. Probably has a certificate for typing speed hanging in her cubicle. They laughed. The kind of easy, casual laughter that men use when they think they're being clever, and no one important is around to hear. The sound carried across the gym, mixing with the clank of equipment and the steady hum of the air circulation system. Staff Sergeant Delaney emerged from the equipment room, carrying his ever-present clipboard, the tool of his trade as gym coordinator. He was built like a fireplug, broad, solid, and immovable, with a face that didn't waste energy on unnecessary expressions. He'd been running this gym for 3 years, had seen every type of soldier from green recruits to crusty veterans, and had developed an eye for trouble that rarely missed its mark. "We're opening live sparring rotation," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the gym floor. "Sign-ups on the board. Light contact only. Respect rank and regulations. Anyone who can't follow those rules can find somewhere else to work out their aggression." Walker finished her warm-up and walked over to the sign-up board, taking the pen attached by a chain and writing her name at the top of the list. Her handwriting was neat, precise, the kind developed by someone who'd filled out countless forms in less than ideal conditions. Delaney glanced at the board and raised an eyebrow. "You cleared for this?" She met his gaze directly. "Yes, Sergeant." Her tone wasn't arrogant or challenging, it was simply absolute. The voice of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and felt no need to justify it to anyone else. Ben had drifted over during the exchange, close enough to read the board over Delaney's shoulder. "She actually signed up," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "This should be good." Walker turned to face him, and something in her expression, still calm, still controlled, but with an edge of anticipation, made him suddenly aware that he might have stepped into something larger than he had intended. "You're welcome to test whatever theories you've been developing," she said. The challenge was offered quietly, without heat or bravado, but it landed with the weight of certainty. Ben felt his grin falter slightly, then forced it back into place, with an effort that fooled no one, least of all himself. "All right, Grandma," he said, the nickname feeling less clever than it had 10 minutes earlier. "Let's see what you've got." Delaney looked between them, his expression suggesting he was beginning to suspect this wouldn't end the way the younger man expected. "Don't embarrass the uniform," he said, but it wasn't clear which of them he was addressing. They squared off in the center of the mat, and the difference between them became immediately apparent. Ben bounced on his toes, rolled his shoulders, and went through an elaborate stretching routine designed more for show than function. He moved like someone who'd learned fighting from movies and training videos, all flash and energy, without the underlying foundation of someone who'd ever had to use these skills for anything more serious than weekend bragging rights. Walker simply stood there, relaxed, but ready, her weight distributed evenly, hands loose at her sides. She wasn't tense, wasn't coiled for action. She was just present in the moment. The kind of stillness settled over her that suggested she could either explode into motion or remain perfectly calm with equal ease. "Go easy on me," Spence said, still grinning, still playing to his small audience of Ben and Tyler. The timer started. For the first few seconds, Spence danced around her, throwing light jabs that were designed more to establish range than to do damage. He was testing her, looking for reactions, trying to read her style, but Emily Walker didn't give him anything to read. She simply tracked his movement, shifting her weight slightly to maintain optimal positioning, watching with a level of attention that suggested she was cataloging everything he showed her. When he finally committed to a real attack, a quick hook meant to demonstrate his speed and skill, she moved. The response was so fluid, so economical, that observers would later disagree about exactly what they'd seen. One moment, Spence was throwing his punch, confident in his technique and timing. The next, he was airborne, his balance destroyed by a hip throw that used his own momentum against him. He hit the mat with a sound that carried clearly across the gym. The air forced from his lungs in a sharp exhalation that spoke of genuine surprise. The room went quiet. Spence lay there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. When he finally rolled to his feet, he was no longer grinning. "Okay," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Lucky shot. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Nothing about what had just happened felt like luck. It felt like precision, like experience, like someone who'd done this before. When the stakes were considerably higher than weekend bragging rights, they squared off again. And this time Spence was more careful, more respectful of her reach and positioning. He tried a different approach, a shoulder charge designed to use his size and strength advantage to overwhelm her defensive posture. Emily Walker sidestepped the charge with minimal effort, hooked his leading leg as he passed, and sent him sprawling across the mat in a controlled fall that left him flat on his back with her knee on his chest, and his wrist twisted at an angle that made his shoulder protest loudly. "Tap," she said, her voice calm and conversational. Spence slapped the mat 3 times in rapid succession, and she released him immediately, stepping back to give him room to recover. He sat up slowly, working his shoulder and trying to understand how someone who looked like a middle-aged office worker had just dismantled him twice in less than 2 minutes. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, still trying to process. Delaney looked down at him with the expression of someone who'd seen this particular lesson taught many times before. "That was not beginner's luck." Ben had gone quiet. Their earlier amusement had been replaced by something approaching respect, or at least the beginning of understanding that they might have misjudged the situation. Emily Walker walked to the edge of the mat and took a sip from her water bottle, her breathing steady and controlled, showing no signs of exertion from the brief encounter. Spence got to his feet and looked at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile what he'd just experienced with his assumptions about who she was and what she represented. "You still think she's here for paperwork?" he asked Tom Rivers, but the question lacked his earlier confidence. The room had shifted. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a tension that came from the recognition that they were in the presence of something they didn't understand. Emily Walker adjusted her wrist wraps with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, and as she did, the compression sleeves shifted again, revealing more of those precise vertical marks burned into her skin. The lesson had begun, but none of them realized yet just how much they still had to learn. The gym's main door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Major Kendall Hayes stepped inside. At 54, he moved with the kind of controlled purpose that came from 3 decades of military service, most of it spent in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. His uniform was pressed but not parade ground. Perfect. The creases sharp but functional rather than ceremonial. He carried a clipboard and moved with the efficient rhythm of an officer making his morning rounds. Fitness compliance checks, personnel évaluation, the endless administrative machinery that kept a base running smoothly. Hayes paused just inside the door, his trained eye automatically scanning the room, cataloging the room's atmosphere. Major Hayes could tell something was off. The usual morning banter was missing, replaced by a tension he could feel even from across the gym. Near the water cooler, Spence sat with a towel around his neck, working his shoulder with the careful movements of someone who'd been introduced to pain they hadn't expected. Darren leaned against the wall, their earlier swagger replaced by something approaching weariness, on the mat. Emily Walker sat calmly adjusting her wrist wraps, her attention focused on the task, with the kind of single-minded concentration that spoke of ritual and habit, rather than nervous energy. Hayes walked over to Delaney, who was studying his clipboard, with the expression of someone trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention without raising the volume. Delaney handed him the clipboard without looking up. "Had an unexpected addition to the sparring roster. Woman signed herself in, said she was cleared." Hayes scanned the list, his pen stopping mid-motion when he reached a particular name. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for someone who knew how to read faces to notice that something significant had just clicked into place. "Briggs," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," Delaney confirmed. "You know her." Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the woman on the mat, studying her with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for serious problems or unexpected opportunities. She was pulling back one of her wrist wraps, adjusting the tension, and as she did, Her compression sleeve shifted enough to reveal what lay beneath. The marks were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Not tattoos, not decorative ink, but something else, entirely vertical lines burned into the skin with surgical precision. Each one exactly the same width and spacing. Hayes counted 9 visible marks, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the implications settled in his mind. He'd seen marks like that before in classified briefings he wasn't supposed to remember, in after-action reports that officially didn't exist. They belonged to a different era, a time when certain units operated under rules that were written in blood rather than regulation manuals, still trying to process what he'd witnessed during the sparring session. Ben called across the room with forced bravado. "She's got those things all over her arms, real dramatic-like. Some kind of warrior, priestess wannabe." The words hit the air and died there, smothered by the weight of Hayes's sudden attention. When the Major spoke, his voice cut through the ambient noise of the gym like a blade through cloth. "Do you boys have any idea what you're looking at?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the kind of inquiry that demanded an answer, the sort of challenge that separated those who knew what they were talking about from those who were simply making noise. Toiver blinked, suddenly aware that he'd wandered into territory he didn't understand. "What?" The fake war paint. Spence shifted uncomfortably. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Darren found urgent business examining his shoelaces. Hayes walked toward Emily Walker, his movement deliberate and respectful. "Mind if I ask where you're stationed these days?" "Sergeant." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. There was no difference in her posture, but no challenge either, just the steady regard of one professional addressing another. "Off the grid. Civilian contractor status was reinstated 8 months ago," she replied. Hayes nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place in his mind. "They finally cleared your paperwork enough to walk back through doors like this one." She nodded slightly, gesturing toward the gym around them. "This one included." He turned back to the 3 younger men who were watching this exchange with growing unease. The casual atmosphere of the morning had been replaced by something heavier, more serious, like the moment when you realize you've been swimming in water deeper than you thought. "Those marks you've been joking about," Hayes said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "They're not decoration? They're not some kind of tough guy accessory you pick up at a tattoo parlor?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Each one represents a confirmed elimination on a mission that never officially happened. That's not ink. That's scar tissue made the way certain echo teams used to mark their confirmed kills when traditional tattoos wouldn't survive the conditions they operated in. But fire would leave a permanent record." The gym had gone completely silent. Even the background noise of other personnel working out seemed muted, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Sergeant Emily Walker ran point for 3rd Reconnaissance Group 7. Deep insertion, non-attributed operations, black-budget missions in places that don't exist on your training maps. Toiver's face had gone pale. "Wait, like actual combat?" "No," Hayes said dryly, "like actual war. The kind where people die if you make mistakes." He gestured toward the marks on Emily Walker's arms, still partially visible beneath the shifted compression sleeves. 9 confirmed kills. That's 9 people who were breathing when she encountered them and weren't breathing when she left. And that's just the documented ones. Spence looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how small his weekend warrior problems really were. "You think they let her walk in here and sign up for sparring matches because they're feeling nostalgic?" Hayes continued. "She's got more confirmed enemy kills than most infantry companies see in an entire deployment." He took a breath, his gaze sweeping across the 3 men who had spent the morning learning a lesson they hadn't expected. "The woman you've been calling Grandma and Paper Soldier has more combat experience than the 3 of you combined will accumulate in your entire military careers, even if you each serve 20 years and see action in every conflict between now and retirement." Emily Walker had finished adjusting her wraps and was quietly packing her gear back into the duffel bag. She hadn't said a word during Hayes's explanation, hadn't felt the need to defend herself or elaborate on her service record. Her silence spoke louder than any boast or explanation could have. Darren finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "We didn't know." "No." Hayes agreed. You didn't. And that's the first real lesson you've learned today. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression serious but not unkind. In the military, you never know who you're talking to. That clerk who processes your paperwork might be a former ranger. That mechanic working on your vehicle might have survived 3 tours in Afghanistan. That quiet woman minding her own business might have skills that would keep you alive in situations you can't even imagine. Hayes turned back to Emily Walker, who had shouldered her duffel and was preparing to leave. "Sergeant," he called out, his voice carrying a note of professional respect. She paused at the threshold, one foot already headed toward the door. "Still sharp," he said. Emily Walker looked back briefly, and for the first time that morning, something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. "Rust was never the problem," she said. And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who had learned something important about assumptions, respect, and the difference between playing soldier and being one. The silence stretched for several seconds after the door closed behind her. No one moved. No one cracked a joke. No one tried to fill the void with nervous laughter or casual conversation, because what had just happened wasn't simply a misunderstanding that had been corrected. It was a fundamental shift in how they understood the world around them, a recognition that they'd been operating with incomplete information and faulty assumptions. Hayes looked at the 3 younger men, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "You're going to remember this morning for a long time," he said finally. "The question is whether you're going to learn from it, or just file it away as an embarrassing story to tell your friends." He tucked his clipboard under his arm and headed toward the door. "Next time you think you know what someone is capable of, based on how they look or how old they are, remember this." Sergeant Emily Walker remembered those marks on her arms and remembered that the most dangerous people in the world are usually the ones who don't need to tell you how dangerous they are. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the 3 men alone with their thoughts and the sudden understanding that they had just received an education that wasn't available in any manual or training program. Emily Walker walked across the parking lot toward her truck, the morning sun warming her back and casting long shadows across the asphalt and behind her. Building 9 looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, but inside, 3 young soldiers were learning that appearances could be deceiving, and that respect wasn't something you gave, it was something you earned. One quiet moment at a time. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered, and whether they chose to learn from it was up to them. Some lessons were like that. You could lead people to wisdom, but you couldn't make them think. But you could make sure they remembered the moment when they realized how much they didn't know. And sometimes, that was enough. Ever met someone you completely misjudged? Someone who turned out to be carrying more than you could have imagined? What would you have done if you'd seen those burn marks? Would you have recognized them for what they really were? Let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story reminded you that quiet strength often runs deeper than loud confidence. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories about the veterans who walk among us every day. Share this with someone who thinks they know what a warrior looks like. More stories like this are waiting for you. Check out our playlist and discover the heroes hiding in plain sight. We'll see you tomorrow, right here on TN Life Tracks.